The wind had a voice in Alaska, a shrill, endless scream that seemed to rise from the earth itself and stretch across the frozen plains. It was not the sound of nature, but of something older, something restless. In the small town of Wrangell, where the mountains cast long shadows over a settlement that time had mostly forgotten, people learned to listen to the wind. It told stories. It carried secrets, and sometimes it warned of death long before anyone saw it coming. On a night that seemed colder than most, when the aurora flickered faintly across a sky too heavy with snow, a man named Caleb Ross vanished. Caleb was a hunter, a man who belonged to the wilderness more than to people. He lived in a cabin miles from town, a small wooden shell crouched at the edge of the forest, surrounded by traps, snares, and the bones of animals long dead. He was the sort who didn't talk much, who nodded instead of speaking and smiled rarely. The people in Wrangell respected him in the way they respected anyone who could survive out there alone. He came into town once a week for supplies, fuel, coffee, ammunition, and always left before dark. But that week he didn't come at all. 3 days later, a pilot flying over the northern ridges spotted something that looked like a snowmobile near a frozen lake, half buried in drifting snow. The engine was still warm when the sheriff's team reached it, a detail that made no sense. The ice beneath it was slick with frost and faintly red, as if something had been dragged across it. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no trail leading away, just that crimson smear vanishing beneath the translucent blue of the frozen surface. Sheriff Dana Mercer stood at the edge of that lake for a long time, the frost clinging to her eyelashes, her hands numb despite her gloves. The wind cut through her parka like knives, but she didn't move. She kept her eyes on that thin line of blood, tracing its curve, imagining the hand that had left it. The stillness was wrong. The air itself felt watchful. A flock of ravens perched in the trees nearby, their black shapes hunched like shadows waiting for something to happen. She had seen many disappearances in her 10 years as sheriff. Alaska swallowed people without mercy. A wrong turn, a storm, a thin patch of ice, it didn't take much. But this was different. Something about the scene felt too controlled, too deliberate. It looked like someone had tried to erase their own presence and almost succeeded. Almost. Dana's deputy, a young man named Keegan who still believed every mystery had a rational answer, crouched by the snowmobile. Fuel's half full. Keys still in the ignition. He didn't just walk away. He said it quietly, as if afraid the trees might be listening. Dana didn't reply. She walked toward the ice where the blood ended, knelt down and brushed her gloved fingers across the surface. The red streak was thin and frozen solid, but beneath the ice, something darker flickered in the pale blue. It wasn't a shadow. It was deeper, something embedded. She leaned closer, peering into the glassy surface, and saw what looked like a shape beneath. Vague, human, distorted by the ripples of frozen water. Her breath fogged the ice, and when she blinked, it was gone. She straightened, the cold biting through her bones. The locals would say it was the lake that took him, that the ice opened for those who didn't respect it. Wrangell had a way of explaining the inexplicable with superstition, because superstition was easier to live with than the truth. But Dana had learned long ago that there were no ghosts in Alaska, only people, and people could be far worse. When she returned to town that night, the diner was half empty, the same few faces sitting at the same corner booths. Conversation stopped when she entered. She carried the cold with her, the kind that silences a room. The cook, a gray-bearded man named Walter, asked if they'd found the hunter. She said no, and the sound of his spatula hitting the griddle echoed like a gunshot. Walter wiped his hands on his apron and lowered his voice. First Eric Lang, now Caleb. You think it's connected? Dana looked at him sharply. What makes you say that? He shrugged, avoiding her eyes. Just seems like too many good men disappearing around those woods lately. That mine out there, Shimmer Hill. Bad things started when they opened it, worse when they closed it. She knew the stories. Everyone did. The mine had been shut down in the late 90s after a chemical spill poisoned the river. killing dozens of fish and 2 workers. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, no one really believed that. Since then, the area around Shimmer Hill had become a no-go zone. Hunters avoided it. Even the animals seemed to. But Caleb lived close, too close. Back in her office, Dana spread out the map of Wrangell County. The frozen lake where the snowmobile was found lay only 6 miles south of the old mining site. The same region where Eric Lang's cabin had been discovered months earlier. Its windows frosted from the inside. The man himself sitting upright in his chair like he'd simply stopped breathing mid-thought. The coroner's report had said cardiac arrest, but Dana hadn't believed it then, and she didn't believe it now. Not with Caleb missing, not with the same cold signature left behind. She turned off the lights and sat in silence. Outside, the snow kept falling in thick, endless sheets. The world was white and still and merciless. She closed her eyes and listened. In Wrangell, you could hear things at night. The cracking of ice, the moan of wind through the trees, the soft scrape of something moving where it shouldn't. The town had its own rhythm, its own secrets frozen in place until someone disturbed them. She thought about Caleb's snowmobile, still warm in the middle of nowhere. About the blood, the missing footprints, the shape under the ice. Every detail felt staged, almost ritualistic. As if someone wanted her to find it, wanted her to look closer. That thought sat heavy in her chest. Wrangell wasn't the kind of place where random acts happened. When people disappeared here, it was because someone wanted them gone. At dawn, she drove back to the lake. The sun barely touched the horizon, a dull orange smear behind the clouds. The temperature had dropped even lower overnight. The world looked untouched again, smooth and empty, as if nothing had ever happened there. The snowmobile was gone. She stood there for a long time, staring at the place where it had been. Her radio crackled with static, and then Keegan's voice broke through, strained and distant. "Sheriff, you need to come back. There's something you need to see." She drove fast, the tires crunching over frost, her pulse a slow, heavy drum. When she reached the station, Keegan was waiting outside, pale and wide-eyed. He held up a small sealed envelope. "This came in for you. No return address." Dana took it inside, tore it open. Inside was a photograph, grainy, taken at night. It showed Caleb Ross standing beside his snowmobile, looking over his shoulder into the dark. Behind him, just barely visible, was a figure. Tall, dressed in black, face hidden beneath a hood. Across the bottom of the photo, written in neat, deliberate letters, were 3 words. He saw too much. Dana stared at it for a long time, her heart thudding in the silence. The photograph felt old, the kind developed in a darkroom rather than printed. Whoever had sent it wanted her to see. Wanted her to understand that Caleb's disappearance wasn't a tragedy of nature. It was something planned. Outside, the wind howled again, sweeping across the roofs and streets like a voice calling her name. Wrangell was full of secrets, and it seemed the ice had just begun to crack open. Dana folded the photograph, slipped it into her pocket, and looked out the window toward the dark edge of the forest. Somewhere out there, beneath the endless snow, something was waiting for her, and it wasn't finished yet, and Eric Lang's death had never sat right with Dana. The official report listed it as heart failure brought on by extreme cold and stress, but she had seen too many bodies, too many crime scenes, to mistake the marks around his neck for anything natural. The bruises were faint, almost invisible beneath the frostbite, but they were there. Thin lines of pressure where fingers had pressed down just long enough to choke the life out of him. The image of his frozen face haunted her still. His eyes had been wide open, pupils blown, his lips slightly parted as if he had been trying to say something before the cold silenced him forever. It wasn't fear that froze him, she thought. It was disbelief. Whoever had come for him, he hadn't expected it. Wrangell was the kind of town where people pretended not to see what they didn't want to understand. They called it the Ice Phantom now, some shadow that lived in the blizzards, taking men who wandered too far into the woods. They said you could hear it breathing if you stood near the mines after sunset, that its voice came with the wind. Dana hated those stories, hated the way people used superstition to make sense of their fear. Monsters didn't crawl out of the snow. They wore faces and names and waited behind locked doors. Eric Lang had once been a company man, one of the supervisors for Shimmer Hill Mine before it shut down. He'd stayed behind after the closure, too bitter to leave. Some said he was guarding something, others that he'd gone mad from the isolation. Dana had read his old file. Divorced, one daughter who'd moved to Anchorage, no criminal record. A clean man, but his name had appeared in a series of old company memos buried deep in public archives. Correspondence hinting at an internal investigation into unauthorized disposal of materials. That phrase, sanitized and cold, made her stomach turn. She sat at her desk that night, staring at the faded copies of those memos under the yellow lamp. The pages smelled of dust and mildew, but the words were sharp enough to bleed. The mine's executives had gone silent after the scandal, every one of them vanishing into new jobs or early retirements. Even the corporate records had been scrubbed clean. She called the state archives office in Juneau, but they told her the same story she'd heard too many times. Those files were destroyed years ago in a warehouse fire. Every trail ended in ashes. She leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. The streets were quiet, just the faint glow of the diner across from the station. The snow fell in soft spirals, catching the orange light of the lamps. She thought about Caleb Ross, about the shape under the ice, about the photograph that had arrived with no return address. He saw too much. The words pulsed in her mind like a heartbeat. Caleb and Eric had both been connected to that mine. Both men had lived close to its ruins. Both were dead or missing. And both had known something they shouldn't have. The next morning, Dana drove to the edge of town where the old mining road began, a frozen scar cutting through the forest. It hadn't been used in years, but the gate was unlocked. She pushed it open and followed the road until the trees swallowed the horizon. The path twisted upward, flanked by black spruces heavy with snow, their branches bending like bowed heads. The silence was suffocating. Even the wind had stopped. After 2 miles, she found what she was looking for. A small cabin half hidden beneath the slope, its roof sagging under layers of frost. Eric Lang's cabin. The door creaked open at her touch, and the cold rushed out like breath from a grave. Everything inside was as it had been the day they'd found him. The chair still faced the window, the firewood neatly stacked by the stove. His coffee mug sat on the table, a ring of brown still marking its rim. Only the chair was empty now. She stepped closer to the stove and knelt beside it. The ashes inside were undisturbed, gray and soft, but at the bottom she found something that hadn't been mentioned in the original report. A metal fragment, small and sharp-edged, about the size of a coin. She held it up to the light. Stamped into the surface were 3 letters. SHM, her pulse quickened. Shimmer Hill Mine. The same initials carved into the brass key found in Caleb's frozen hand. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a connection. She took photographs, sealed the fragment in an evidence bag, and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, she heard something faint. A creak from the floorboards behind her. She froze, every nerve screaming. The cabin was small. There was nowhere to hide. She turned slowly, flashlight raised. Nothing. Just the empty chair, the still air, the faint drip of melting frost from the ceiling. Yet the air felt wrong, thicker somehow, as if someone had just left the room. She stepped outside, her breath sharp in the cold. The snow around the cabin was untouched. No footprints but her own. She waited, listening, and then she heard it. The faint hum of an engine somewhere in the trees. Not a snowmobile, too deep and steady. A generator, maybe? She followed the sound. moving cautiously through the drifts until she reached a clearing where the remains of an old pipeline jutted from the ground. The sound was coming from beneath it, a vent leading down into the mine's old tunnels. She crouched beside it, feeling the faint vibration through the metal. The mine was supposed to be abandoned, shut down and sealed, yet something was alive down there. She returned to town just after dusk. Keegan was waiting at the station, tapping his pen nervously against a report. "You were out there again," he said. "You shouldn't go alone, Dana, not with everything that's happening." "I found something," she said, ignoring the warning in his voice. She handed him the evidence bag. He turned it over in his hands. "Same initials as the key," he said softly. "They're connected," Dana said. "The mine, Caleb, Eric. Whoever's behind this is trying to cover something up." Keegan frowned. "Cover what?" "The mine's been dead for years." Dana looked past him, out the window into the black swirl of snow. Then why is there still power running down there? That night she couldn't sleep. The town was silent except for the occasional groan of the wind pushing against the glass. She lay awake, thinking about the people who had once worked at Shimmer Hill, about the waste spill, the missing records, the faces in the photographs she'd found on the wall of that underground room. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the truth stayed buried. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in a place where the ice never forgets. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated before answering. "Sheriff Mercer," she said. For a moment there was only static, then a voice low and distant as if carried through miles of snow. "You shouldn't have gone to the cabin." Her throat tightened. "Who is this?" "You don't understand what you're digging up," the voice said. "It's still alive." The line went dead. Dana sat there staring at the phone in her hand, her pulse hammering. Outside the wind had risen again, but it wasn't just the wind she heard. It was the low, steady hum of something mechanical, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere beneath the frozen ground. She crossed the room to the window, across the snowy field, toward the forest where the mine lay buried. A single light flickered, pale and steady, like an eye watching her through the storm. She stood there for a long time, unmoving until the light finally went out. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, erasing everything. But she knew one thing now with absolute certainty. Someone was down there in the dark, guarding whatever secrets the mine had left behind. And Caleb Ross, Eric Lang, maybe even others. They hadn't just disappeared. They had been silenced. Dana turned away from the window and sat at her desk again, pulling out the files she'd gathered over the years. Unexplained deaths, disappearances, unsolved cases. When she drew a circle around each name connected to Shimmer Hill, the map bloomed with a pattern that made her stomach twist. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone was cleaning up history, one man at a time. And now, she thought, it was her turn to dig deeper. Whatever waited in those tunnels beneath the frozen skin of Alaska wasn't done yet, and neither was she. The call came at 2 a.m, the kind of hour when only bad news knows how to find you. Dana woke to the shrill ring of her phone slicing through the silence, the sound blending with the faint howl of the wind against her window. She answered before the second ring. On the other end, the voice of a fisherman trembled through the static, thick with disbelief. He'd been out on the edge of Lake Harrow, cutting holes through the ice when his auger struck something that wasn't ice. At first he'd thought it was driftwood frozen beneath the surface. Then he saw the fingers, white, rigid, and reaching upward as if begging to be pulled free. By dawn, Dana was there, her breath fogging against the first pale light crawling over the horizon. The air was so cold that her eyelashes stuck together when she blinked. The fisherman stood a few feet away, wrapped in layers that made him look twice his size, his face chalk white. "I didn't touch it," he kept saying. "Swear to God I didn't touch it." The hand jutted up from the ice, half encased in frost, the fingernails blackened with blood. Dana crouched beside it. The fingers were curled, locked in the rigor of death. But something gleamed in the frozen palm, a small brass key. Its surface etched with 3 letters that made her stomach drop. SHM. The same letters as the fragment she'd found in Eric Lang's stove. The same as the Shimmer Hill mine. She called Keegan over. He stared at the hand, his face drawn tight. "You think it's him? Only one way to know," she said quietly. When the ice was cut and the body pulled free, the forensics team worked in silence. The corpse was intact, preserved perfectly by the cold. The skin was gray and smooth, the veins beneath it dark blue. Caleb Ross. His face was unmistakable, though his eyes were gone, the sockets hollow and rimmed with frost. The key was embedded deep in his palm, as if he'd died clutching it with his last breath. The coroner said it looked like he'd been submerged under the ice for weeks, maybe months. But Dana knew that wasn't possible. His snowmobile had been found only days ago, its engine still warm. It was as though time itself had broken, freezing one moment and erasing the rest. Later that night, as she stood in the morgue under the fluorescent lights, she noticed something strange. Beneath Caleb's fingernails were flecks of black soot, oil residue, the kind used in heavy machinery. She leaned closer. "The mine," she whispered to herself. He was there. She returned to the evidence board in her office, pinning Caleb's photo beside Eric Lang's. 2 men, both linked to Shimmer Hill, 2 deaths tied to the same letters. She followed the chain of evidence, maps, reports, missing person files, and every trail curved back to that place in the mountains. The mine wasn't just a coincidence. It was the center. She packed her gear and drove out before sunrise, snow whipping across her windshield in sheets. The forest loomed darker the farther she went, the trees like black sentinels closing in. When she reached the clearing where the mine once operated, she found the rusted skeletons of machinery half buried in snow. The sign at the gate was still there, its words faded but legible. Shimmer Hill Mining, Codiastier, 1979. A hole in the ground. A scar left by greed, and now something far worse. She walked the perimeter, her boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The air smelled faintly of chemicals even after all these years. Then she found a hatch partially hidden beneath a drift of snow, its handle rusted but still intact. She brushed it clean and pulled. It opened with a moan that echoed into the dark below. A set of metal stairs descended into the earth, swallowed by shadow. She hesitated at the threshold, the wind pressing at her back. The cold from below rose like breath from a buried body, but she went down. The air grew warmer as she descended, heavy with the metallic tang of rust and dampness. At the bottom, her flashlight beam caught the glint of wet concrete walls, old pipes and tracks leading deeper underground. The tunnels were still powered, barely. Somewhere a generator hummed, a low and steady vibration that made the ground tremble under her boots. She followed the sound through a maze of corridors. Every few feet she found signs of life. A half-eaten meal on a table, a set of fresh footprints in the dust, a coat hung neatly on a hook. Whoever had been here hadn't gone far. Then she reached a room that stopped her breath cold. It was circular, the walls lined with filing cabinets and corkboards. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly. On the main wall, maps and photographs were pinned in chaotic layers, connected by red string like veins of blood. Dana stepped closer. Every face on that wall was someone from Wrangell. Missing persons, victims, people whose cases had gone cold. She recognized them all. At the center, Caleb Ross, directly beside him, Eric Lang. Her heart pounded as she scanned the rest of the board. And then she saw it, her own face pinned beside the others. A recent photo, one she hadn't seen before. Across the bottom, written in thick black marker, was a single word: next. The flashlight trembled in her hand. She turned slowly, every nerve alert. The tunnels were silent, but she could feel it again. That presence. Watching. Breathing. The hum of the generator pulsed like a heartbeat. Steady, mechanical, alive. She crossed to the filing cabinets and pulled one open. Inside were files marked with initials and dates. Most were old, yellowed with age, but some were recent. Reports, surveillance logs, even transcripts of her calls. She found one with her name on it. Inside was a single page, her schedule, her patrol routes, the time she left her office. Every movement accounted for. Someone had been following her for months. A sound echoed from somewhere behind her, a soft metallic clang that made her spin around. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady but low. The only reply was the echo of her own voice coming back distorted through the tunnels. She raised her flashlight toward the source, the beam cutting through the dark. It caught something, a figure at the far end of the hall. For a second she thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved. Slow, deliberate. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm. "Stop right there." The figure froze. Then without a sound it turned and slipped into the shadows. She ran after it, boots hammering against concrete, the tunnel twisting and branching like a maze. The generator's hum grew louder the deeper she went until she reached a large chamber filled with industrial equipment. The figure was gone, but the machines were alive. Rows of them, old mining drills, conveyors, and compressors, all running as if someone had restarted the operation. The noise was deafening. She found the generator in the corner, its control panel blinking with new data. Someone had rerouted power back to the tunnels. She pulled the main lever to shut it down. The hum died instantly, leaving only the sound of dripping water and her own breathing. In the sudden silence, she noticed something she hadn't before. A mirror bolted to the wall, cracked and filthy. She stepped closer, wiping away a streak of grime. Reflected in the glass behind her was the map room, its board of faces glowing faintly under the dying light. For a second she saw movement, someone standing just behind her reflection. A tall shape, still and silent. She spun around, gun raised, but there was nothing there. The mirror, however, now had a single phrase scratched into it. She hadn't seen it before, but it was clear as blood. "The ice remembers." Her breath caught. The words matched the message she'd found written behind the maps in the previous chamber. Whoever was doing this wasn't just killing. They were leaving warnings. Messages that sounded less like threats and more like prophecy. She stood there, trembling slightly, the cold finally sinking through her layers. Then she heard footsteps again, faint but close, receding deeper into the mine. She followed them until they disappeared into another corridor that ended abruptly in a wall of ice. The surface wasn't natural. It was smooth, cut cleanly as if shaped by human hands. Inside it, barely visible, was something dark and indistinct. Shapes that might have been bodies, frozen mid-motion, trapped forever in that translucent grave. Dana reached out, pressing her palm against the ice. It was warm. The realization chilled her more than the cold ever could. The mine wasn't just a tomb. It was alive. When she finally emerged hours later, the dawn light was gray and weak, the air sharp with frost. She looked back once at the entrance, now half covered in snow, and knew she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The walls of Shimmer Hill were breathing, and whatever had been buried down there wasn't finished. Caleb Ross's key, the letters, the faces, they were all part of something bigger, something that stretched far beyond Wrangell. By the time Dana emerged from the mine, the sun had slipped below the mountains again and the cold had returned like a punishment. The storm had rolled in fast, wind slicing through the trees, snow whipping across the road in blinding sheets. She drove through it, headlights cutting narrow tunnels of light through the darkness, her mind replaying every detail of what she'd seen underground. The photographs, her own face marked next. The bodies frozen behind the ice, suspended in silent agony. Every mile between her and Wrangell felt longer than the last. When she finally reached the edge of town, the storm had quieted, leaving the world ghostly and still. She pulled into the station lot, killed the engine, and sat in the silence. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. There was no sound except the soft ticking of cooling metal. The reflection in the windshield stared back at her, hollow-eyed, dusted with snow. A woman who looked older than she remembered. She told herself she'd file a report, call the state investigators, hand it all over. Let someone else take the burden. But she knew that wasn't an option. Not anymore. The people behind this were too careful, too precise. If they'd known where she lived, where she worked, what time she drove home at night, they could easily make her vanish like the rest. The lights in the station were off when she went inside. The air was cold, the silence thick. She flicked the switch and the fluorescents buzzed to life one by one, washing the room in pale light. Her desk looked untouched, but something felt wrong. The air smelled faintly of metal, gun oil maybe. She noticed the window near her desk was cracked open an inch. Snow gathered along the sill. Keegan's desk was empty. His parka was gone from its hook. She tried calling his radio, but the line was dead. Then she noticed the file drawer slightly ajar. Inside, the evidence bags from Caleb Ross's case were missing. The key, the map photos, the fragment from Eric Lang's cabin, all gone. In their place lay a single envelope, pale gray, unmarked. Her throat tightened as she opened it. Inside was a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken from above. It showed her standing in the mine earlier that day. Flashlight raised, her reflection caught in the cracked mirror. Beneath it, written in the same neat handwriting as before, were 3 words. You shouldn't have come. Her hand shook as she dropped the photo onto her desk. She grabbed her sidearm and stepped back outside, scanning the street. The snow had stopped, leaving everything coated in a perfect, untouched layer of white. The town slept beneath it, quiet as a graveyard. Somewhere in that silence, something moved. She caught it in the corner of her eye. A figure standing at the end of Main Street, half shrouded in fog. It didn't move, just watched. When she raised her flashlight, the beam barely reached it, the light diffusing through the mist. Then slowly the figure turned and walked away into the dark. Dana followed, her boots crunching through the snow, her breath sharp in the air. The figure led her past the shuttered diner, past the frozen docks toward the old logging road that vanished into the forest. The deeper she went, the quieter it became, until the only sound left was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She lost sight of the figure when the fog thickened, but she kept walking until the trees opened into a clearing. That's when she saw it. The generator she'd shut off at the mine, now humming again, half buried in snow, its cable snaking into the ground. A faint orange glow pulsed beneath the ice around it, rhythmic, alive. Dana knelt down, brushing the snow aside, and realized the generator wasn't powering lights, it was powering heat. It was thawing the ice. Beneath the translucent surface, something moved. At first she thought it was the reflection of the wind in the ice. Then she saw fingers, pale, bloated, twitching. The frozen bodies she'd seen in the mine, they were no longer still. One hand pressed against the ice from below, the nails scraping weakly. Another followed, then another. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The hum of the generator deepened, louder, faster, and the cracks began to spread through the ice like veins. A voice came from behind her, calm and familiar. You shouldn't have come back, Sheriff. She turned, gun raised. Keegan stood there, his parka zipped up, his face pale beneath the beam of her light. What are you doing out here? She demanded. He smiled faintly, and in that instant she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Detachment, almost pity. You weren't supposed to find it, he said. You should have left it buried like everyone else. Dana's voice hardened. What is this? What's under there? He looked past her at the glowing ice. Remnants, mistakes, men who thought they could profit from death and walk away clean. The mine wasn't just a mine. They dumped everything down there, chemicals, waste, bodies. The company covered it up, paid people off. When the cold came, the ground froze it all solid, but nothing stays buried forever. The ice keeps what it's given. She felt the weight of his words sink into her like stones. You're working for them, she said. Keegan's eyes flicked back to her. No, I'm just keeping balance. Someone has to. He stepped closer and she saw something metallic glinting in his gloved hand. The brass key. Caleb's key. He held it up between them. This opens the chamber beneath the lake, he said. That's where it started. That's where it ends. The ground beneath them groaned, a deep cracking sound. Dana took a step back, gun still trained on him. You killed them, she said. Eric, Caleb, all of them. He shook his head slowly. They weren't innocent. They were part of it. When the company shut down, they stayed behind to clean up. They thought they could hide what they'd done, but the ice saw. It remembers everything. The crack spread wider, a sharp sound like breaking glass echoing through the clearing. Water surged up from beneath, hissing as it met the air. The figures below the ice pressed closer, faces forming in the translucent surface, their mouths open in silent screams. Keegan's voice dropped to a whisper. You can't stop it now. The thaw's begun, Dana fired. The gunshot shattered the quiet, echoing through the trees. Keegan staggered back, eyes wide, the key slipping from his hand and disappearing into the snow. He fell to his knees, then crumpled, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then the ice split open. The lake roared as water and slush erupted upward, sending shards of ice flying into the air. Dana stumbled back, shielding her face. From the opening, shapes emerged, bodies, dozens of them, rising with the current, their skin gray, their eyes open. They floated for a moment, weightless in the swirling mist, before sinking back into the black water below. The generator sparked, shorted, and went dark. The hum died. The clearing fell silent again. When the storm cleared the next morning, the lake had frozen over once more. Keegan's body was gone. The snow was unbroken, the surface pristine, as if nothing had ever happened there. Back in town, Dana filed her report, but she left most of it blank. There was no evidence, no witnesses, nothing she could prove. The state would call it an accident, maybe a collapse. They'd close the case just like all the others. Weeks passed. The snow melted slowly and spring came like a ghost that didn't belong. But Dana couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there watching. The nights were quieter now, but sometimes when the wind shifted just right, she thought she could hear the faint hum of that generator again, buried beneath the ice. One evening she walked to the edge of the frozen lake alone. The air was still. The setting sun turned the surface gold. She knelt, gloved fingers brushing the ice. For a moment she thought she saw something move beneath it. A flicker of light, or maybe a reflection. Then a handprint appeared, pressed against the ice from below, clear and perfect. Her breath caught. The fingers curled once, then disappeared. She stayed there until the last of the light faded, the world turning blue and silent around her. Some secrets, she realized, were never meant to be solved. The ice didn't just hide the truth, it guarded it. It kept it alive. That night, long after she'd gone home, a faint crack echoed through the valley. In the morning, the lake had shifted again, a jagged fissure cutting across its surface. The locals said it was the temperature, the natural movement of frozen water. But those who listened closely swore they heard something else. A whisper rising from beneath, soft and steady like breath against glass. And deep under the ice, where the cold never truly sleeps, something moved again. The frozen secrets of Shimmer Hill were stirring, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to dig where the dead refused to stay buried.